Hi guys, Tайлер Forestер for RunItOnce.com. Today we're going to be going over a 2-4-3-6 live session I played. We're going to be looking at only hands that saw the flop. We lose a little bit here because you're not going to see the spots where I 4-bet bluffed, but in general it'll keep most of the integrity of the game. If you followed the other series, you know that the footage behind this video didn't turn out very well. So I've been using this format instead, and I think it gives us a little more in-depth analysis of these situations. So we start here with El Ponchis raising in the cutoff, and I defend 9-8 suited in the big blind. 3-betting, it's fine. My analysis tells me that either 3-bet or calling here is roughly the same value. What's important in this situation as the big blind is making sure that you have a balanced range to respond to 4-bets. And if I chose every suited connector to 3-bet here, I would probably end up having to fold too often when I get 4-bet, especially to larger sizes. The smaller sizes, you'd be able to call the 4-bets with these hands. But that isn't enough of a justification to do it all the time. So I'm calling today. The flop comes down king, king, 2 with the king of spades. I have the backdoor spade draw, of course, but I'm still planning on check folding this flop. The 9 and the 8 are too low. Even though when they pair, I'm going to make a little bit of money, I don't think it's enough money to justify my call, especially against El Poncho's cutoff range. If he was in the small blind or the button, his range is going to be enough wider that the 9 and 8 will have significant value, and I might consider calling a bet on this board texture. So he checks through. And the jack of clubs peels. And I don't choose to bet here with 9-8 of spades because I really have no equity and I really have no blockers to any flushes, any potential flush draws, any potential straight draws. Queen 5 of hearts here is a better bet because it blocks his queens, and if a 10 or an ace comes out, it makes it far less likely he has the straight, and it also blocks queen jack. So if I was going to look to start a pure air hand to bluff here, I would be looking to start hands that have queens, 10s, and aces in them. And 9-8 suited has none of those cards, so I will be check folding. El Ponchi checks through. And on this 6 river, I contemplate bluffing, and I end up not bluffing here. And I'm going to show you guys in a second why not. And we see El Ponchi's showdown. Ace Queen of clubs, which is certainly a strong hand and probably semi-justifies me not bluffing the turn as a exploitive play. Because it's pretty obvious that El Ponchi's aware of the fact that I could be bluffing the turn or the river with these low cards, and he wants to make sure I'm indifferent to it. And he has given himself some protection on club rivers. I can't wantonly overbet him anymore on say, the 5 of clubs. There'll be no shoving 20x pot. Or at least very rarely. So back to 9-8 suited on this board texture and why I didn't bet the river. If we look at a hold'em equity calculator here, most of the time we're going to be trying to make ace 10 indifferent to calling this river bet. That's roughly the cutoff hand for making a bluff profitable or unprofitable against most players. And we'll see that I actually end up with quite a bit of air here. I end up with 9-8, 9-7, 8-7, 7-5, 7-4, 5-4, 5-3, 4-3, and that's quite a few combos of air. And it turns out really to make him indifferent to, say, calling a 2/3 pot size bet, that I have to bet every hand, every pair on this board. I have to bet my ace-2 combinations, I need to bet my 3s, my 4s, all my 6s, some of the jacks I've slow played. I excluded the kings because I assumed I'd be taking an overbet strategy to it. And though that adds some complication into this equation, this gives you a general sense of how light I'd have to be value betting to be able to bluff 9-8 here optimally, and we see that it's probably too low. I don't think that most players are betting ace-2 on this river, and I'm not sure if it's a good value bet. I'd expect El Ponchi to have a fair number of pairs here, and we'll see that if ace-10 has 30% here, fours has like 40%, so it's a pretty clear call from El Ponchi's perspective. And if we really wanted to make, say, fours indifferent to calling with this range, we'd end up needing a very large bet. So 9-8 suited is just a hand I have to check the river and lose the pot with. Otherwise, I'll be very unbalanced, and he should be able to profitably call all his ace highs against me, or very close to it. So we have ace-4 of diamonds in the cutoff position. Chaos Gen has 3-bet us on the button. And what we see from Chaos is that he tends to 3-bet very lightly after 1,000 hands. He's 3-betting almost 16% against every position. It looks like it's basically flat. And this has a reasonably sized sample with 1,000 hands played against him. So I have to assume that he's actually pretty loose in these situations. And he's showing down 7-7 on the button, 3-betting the cutoff, which it's the third red line down on the bottom graph. So we can assume that his range is depolarized, probably really extensively. If we look at this, he's probably cold calling very rarely. Yeah, it looks like he cold calls basically never. So he's just 3-betting the top 16% of his hands. Ace-4 of diamonds plays really well against almost any range in this situation, and I certainly have the ability to flat here and probably show a profit. I decided that it was far enough down my flatting range that I felt comfortable 4-betting it against him, and if we look at the way he chooses to play against 4-bets, we'll see that he plays mainly a call or fold strategy. So he's folding roughly 40 to 50% of the time when he faces a 4-bet, and he's calling the other 40% of the time, and probably jamming about 10% of the time, is what this stat line looks like. So I have to assume that I'm going to be seeing the flop quite frequently when I 4-bet him, and I'd like a hand with some playability. Because of this, ace-4 of diamonds falls in this category. So since this video only involves hands that have seen the flop, I suspect you guys know that we're going to the flop. And on this board texture, his range is still really wide at this point in time. If he's folding roughly half of his 16% range, he still has the top 8% of hands. This board isn't particularly great for me, but it's also not terrible either. It's a fairly mediocre board. We're going to see him fold things like Jack-10 suited, King-Jack suited. He may fold some of his ace-kings on the flop, though I think that's relatively unlikely. And then there's going to be some small suited connectors that fold. My range is strong enough here that I feel fairly comfortable betting a small amount. Even if he never folded, I think that he probably will make some incorrect calls against my range. On the 8 of diamonds, I choose to check. I need to continue with some bluffs here, but it seems like ace-4 of diamonds is a good give-up hand because it has little or no equity at this point, and I'm going to be betting the river if he checks behind. We played a hand prior to this several days before this, where I check-raised aces on the turn against him, and he ended up having kings in a very similar situation. So I can assume that he's probably going to make a small bet here with most of his large hands, which should make my turn check more profitable to bluff the river. Because when I bluff the river, he's going to have stripped out some of the stronger hands in his range. And it doesn't hurt that I checked aces to him the last time this situation occurs, so it's going to be in the back of his mind that I can still have a real hand. And the Jack of Club falls, which is, I think probably a better card for his range than mine, though at the same time, if we assume he flatted 7s pre-flop, and now it's called the 6-3 flop, Queen 6-3 flop with them, which I'd expect him to do probably close to 100% of the time, he's going to end up with a lot of mid pairs that fold this river, even if he defends all of his queens, and occasionally wakes up with a flush or a set here. So I choose a dopey bet. I don't like my bet sizing here. I think it was a sloppy bet. I have an auto bet on my slider for, it looks like that's about 66% of pot. So I obviously just clicked it as opposed to jamming, which I'm not a fan of. But he folds rather quickly, and let's take a look in Card Runner's EV and see if this was a good bluff. This is the Card Runner's EV sim for the last hand. We see me raising Ace-4 of diamonds in the cutoff, and then we see him 3-betting roughly 16% of hands. It's a non-polarized range. It's completely linear. So I'm going to include offsuit broadways, suited connectors, 4s through aces, ace-king off. I think this is a pretty standard non-linear, or a very standard linear range for this situation. If you're going to choose to 3-bet 16%, this is probably pretty close to what it looks like. And then when we 4-bet, I'm going to have him defending by always calling here, and he's going to call hands that he thinks are profitable to appeal to the 4-bet, and that ends up being suited connectors and pocket pairs mainly, with some bigger broadways cards, ace-queen, and king-queen suited, king-jack suited. And when we hit this flop, we'll see that he ends up actually basically just never folding when we c-bet here. He ends up with one pair 65% of the time, and a lot of that one pair is below the queen. And then he ends up with a couple of flush draws, he ends up with this straight draw down here, and then I have him floating ace-king on this board texture. I feel like most players, when they call it pre-flop, don't like to fold the flop, especially to a small bet. And then on this 8 turn, I now have him betting behind me with kings, ace-queen off, 5-4. This frequency may be off. I assume since I'd slow played against him the last hand that he was going to be more reticent to bet some of his more marginal draws for fear of being check raised. So I have to assume that his range is going to be mainly pairs looking for protection. Protection's a broad word here. Pairs that could get sucked out on that are likely the best hand now, which include kings and ace-queen. And then he's going to be taking the checking route most of the time with his hands, almost 80% of the time. He's going to be checking this turn. This seems to be consistent with how most players play in this situation, and this particular player was more conservative than most when it came to post-flop play. And so on the jack of clubs, I bet 2/3 pot, and we see that even if he calls with top pair or better, which I don't think is a shoe-in here, that he's only going to be calling 40% of the time, and that includes him slow playing things like sets and aces here, which isn't necessarily going to be true. Some players will bet the turn with him. I just assumed as a balancing mechanism that he would be usually checking his sets on the turn to pick off a river bet. We get all the money in almost every time with aces and kings, no matter what the river card is. So he really has no fear of checking back and losing value. All that happens is he ends up making more money when I bluff him on the river. And then we see him folding 60% of the time here. So with a 2/3 pot size bet, this is a really profitable bluff. You really should only be folding here about 38 to 40% of the time, and instead he's folding 60%. So I have really just a slam dunk bluff here. Okay, so the next hand I have ace-jack of clubs in the small blind, and I 3-bet a button open. This is a very standard play. The button opener happens to be a fish. Recreational player, excuse me. He is semi-competent after 67 hands, but he did do something weird in one of the previous videos where he check raised me to like $300 and then folded to the last 100 on the turn in a 3-bet pot. So I have to assume that he enjoys playing poker, but he's probably not a professional. And we see that he's opened up 2 out of 5 times on the cutoff and 3 out of 5 times on the button. Between those two statistics, I feel relatively comfortable in assuming that his button range is relatively large, probably between 40 and 60% of the time. This is a generalization based on his overall HUD stats at the time, where he appears to be positionally competent. And then, more specifically, those 2 smaller samples seem in line with a normal tag opening range in this situation, so I'm going to assume that he normally opens here like a tag. And on this board texture, I have a backdoor draw. I have ace high. Ace high definitely has showdown value on this board texture. I'm going to be making a small bet here because from playing with Pile Solver, it looks like small bets out of position. You can basically do 100% of the time on most board textures and 3-bet pots. This is due for the fact that he 4-bets off the top of his range, so we almost always have an equity advantage on this sort of board. He has more combinations of 2s through 5s than we do, and things like 5-4 suited, and less combinations of ace, queen, kings, aces, jacks, queens. So by making a small bet here, I should be able to fold the bottom end of his range and not allow him to bluff me. It should be roughly optimal. And he calls, and of course on this turn card, I'm going to be check folding. I have ace high. Of course, he'll have some draws here, but there isn't enough draws to justify this call, especially with the jack in my hand. It actually blocks a lot of his main floats on this board texture. So I fold relatively rapidly. We see me now with king 4 suited in the big blind. El Ponchis is going to open smaller on the button. Of course, this is a defend against basically every button range at this sizing from the big blind. This board texture doesn't hit me particularly hard, but we'll see that El Poncho opens up the button fairly widely. I guess only 42% of the time, but he still ends up with a fair number of air combinations. So we're going to see me float this board texture with king high in the backdoor flush draw with the intention of bluffing some runouts. If the board blanks and comes out 2-2, I probably won't be bluffing the river, because I'm going to end up with a lot of hands like 7-6 here that will want to bluff. Queen Jack. And when he bets smallish on this 3 of clubs turn, I'm of course folding. This is probably one of the weakest hands equity-wise in my range at this point in time. So it's a relatively easy fold. A recreational player limps on the button. I'll be ISOing with ace-2 suited. I'm well ahead of his limping range. We see that he's played 86% of hands after 36 hand samples, so his range is very wide, and ace-2 suited plays very well against almost any range. So I think I have a relatively easy ISO at this point in time. I choose a small bet on this flop texture under the same assumption as the last hand. My hand range is really far ahead of his calling range, and the small bet is optimal in this situation. And he calls, which doesn't necessarily mean much at this point in time. This sort of player could call me with things like ace-5. It looks like he's actually folded quite often to flop c-bets, which is interesting. That probably makes my turn call here a little bit rougher, because I'd usually expect him to just check fold the flop when he missed. But it's certainly possible the smaller bet size induced him to bet. And what I've found from playing around with the GTO software is calling the turn here with any pair on board is quite standard. So I make the standard play of calling the deuce here, and then he bets the river, and of course this has to be near the bottom of my range. If I'd chosen to check call a flush draw, I might be slightly worse on this board texture, but not very many hands are. So I have a relatively easy fold on the 7 of spades. Even though he's very loose, I'm not willing to call him very lightly because I can't make an assumption about how he plays his air hands compared to how he plays his marginal hands. And a looser player is almost as likely to bet a 9 here for value as they are to bluff something like Jack 10 on this run out. So I don't want to be calling 2s against him because he could be value betting things like 9s. We could even see a player like this value bet something like a 5 here. So something like 10s would be a very clear call on the river, even though it blocks some of his straight draws because it beats his 9s. Whereas ace 2, which doesn't block any draw, but loses to the 9s, is now a very easy fold. And we're to the same hand again. Okay, we're on. Queen 10 off, standard open on the button. El Pancho defends in the big blind. And on this board texture, again, El Pancho is defending the big blind very loosely. At this point, he's at 71% after 14 samples. So we can assume that he's probably defending at least 55% of his range as a cold call here, which is going to make Queen 10 here very valuable. And in fact, I could consider a small bet on this board texture just to fold out his minimal equity with things like 7-6. He's not going to try to defend against that. And then on this turn, when the queen pairs, I choose a bigger bet sizing. I'm going to be bifurcating my range here between Queen X and air. Things like King 2 or King 3 that check back the flop. Maybe as high as King Jack that check back the flop here. So I want to make a relatively large bet and really try to maximize my value against his bluff catchers. He's not going to have a queen or better here more than 3 or 4% of the time. So I have very little worry about bluffing into a queen too often with the bigger bet sizing. Queens and cutoff will probably make some money with this hand. I get 3-bet here to $30, and at the time, these stats have since moved up in the world. He was only 3-betting me 3% of the time at the time this hand occurred, so I chose to flat. If he's 3-betting between 3 and 5%, 4-bet getting in queens is not a strong play. It's going to be a slight money loser. So I'm going to choose to flat here against his perceived strategy. It turns out that my estimate was probably wrong, or my HUD stats have changed. I switched databases, so these stats aren't necessarily what I had day of. And I flop top set, which is amazing. So I'm checking, of course. There's no argument for a donk bet at this point in time. I want him to use his auto c-bet. My range is fairly far behind his. If he's only opening up, if he's only 3-betting me 3 to 5% of the time, I'm probably looking at a range of aces and kings, queens, ace-king off, and then some variety of suited bluffs. And I flat the flop c-bet to try to let him hit something, and I think that I may have played this hand slightly awry at this point in time, because I choose to check raise the turn. And I think at my thinking at the time was he was probably going to end up checking back aces and ace-king on the river, and I didn't think that he would necessarily fold them to a turn check raise. I actually can come up with quite a few bluffs on this board texture. Things like jacks with a spade or tens with a spade would make a really excellent check raise on this turn as a bluff. And he's going to be barreling this card fairly widely. So even though tens with a spade might not be a great call here, if he folds something like king jack here to check raise, it becomes a very viable check raise bluff. And he calls. And then the 8 of diamonds hits. I shove the river. I think this play is probably marginally profitable, but I'm on the fence about it, of course, because if he was 3-betting like 4% of the time, and his range was suited aces, ace-king, kings, aces, when he bets the turn and calls the check raise, if he occasionally folds ace-king on the turn to the check raise, he usually ends up with quite a few nut combinations on the river. And I think he ends up with right around 6 to 7 combinations of flushes and sets that beat me. So I need him to call basically all his aces and occasionally a combination of ace-king to make that a profitable river jam, which traditionally has been, it's okay. It's not great. It's a marginal situation that's unfortunate because usually queens, middle set is usually a very strong hand. In this situation, it gets pretty marginal by the river. And we see Queen Jack out of the small blind. I suspect we're going to see me ISO Hallamur again. Apparently I'm just calling. That was a mistake. If he is playing 86% of hands, Queen Jack is going to be well ahead of his range. And of course I'm just check folding at this point in time. Sixes, pretty easy to open and cut off. I'm being 3-bet here. I get a flat from the looser recreational player, and then the big blind overcall flats, which I'm unsure what sort of range he'd want to do this with. I guess maybe there's some argument to do this with some smaller pocket pairs, possibly like 6s through 9s, under the assumption that if you hit a set, you're going to win a gigantic pot. I think that most hands, we see that Grubrici here 3-bets me about 10% of the time in this spot. So any hand like, say, jacks would be a better 4-bet get-in against the fish, and probably a 4-bet get-in against Grubrici as well. Which narrows El Pancho's range down maybe to some suited connector type hands that have chosen to call pre-flop on a whim, or some middle pocket pair hands that are really looking forward to flopping a set. And hopefully winning a gigantic pot. And when Neuro leads this board with 6s, of course, I'm folding. Grubrici calls, and I, of course, have the backdoor flush drawn now. I probably win this pot if I'd gotten all in here. I would suspect at this point in time Grubrici usually has something, but I might be wrong. He could have ended up with, like, jacks with the jack of diamond, but most of the time when he peels the turn, he doesn't have that. Ace-4 of clubs. There we go. Apparently my software slow played me. That makes a lot of sense. I'd usually expect Grubrici to have a very viable hand once he calls the turn bet on the ace of diamonds. 4s here, I think will see me either flat or 3-bet. Both options are relatively viable. Against weaker players, I tend to flat 4s here because they tend to play pretty well flatted out of the small blind. And I'm not as concerned about balance. And then on this Queen 10-2 board, of course, it's an auto-fold. I'm taking I played this hand against an under-the-gun raise. So we see a small blind open. I'm going to be defending here. I do have some info on him. He opens up 41% of the time. The pot odds are too good to fold, however. Being in position and having great pot odds is a great scenario for flatting lots of hands. And he leads this board for a 60% pot size bet. I'm not going to be defending this hand. We'll see me open up ace-2 of diamonds against the small blind here. And on this board texture, I have several options. A small bet probably works fine against most defending strategies in the big blind right now, because as we saw in the prior hand, things like Queen 7 with the 7 of club hearts here are most likely folding to a bet, and that's going to make up a reasonable part of his range. I don't have a lot of info in this situation against him. It looks like in general he doesn't like to cold call from the big blind, but he's managed to cold call twice against small blind raises. I really have no idea how often he's cold calling here. So I'm going to choose the smaller bet size as a balancing play to try to maximize my value with my bluffs. The ace-2 might play better as a check, or it might play better as a big bet in a vacuum. But once we look at my overall range, I want to keep the bet sizes smaller. And then on the 7 of hearts river, I really have no fear of the 7 of hearts. He's going to have made 2 pair or a flush here occasionally, but it's not going to be more than about 10% of the time. So I have a fairly comfortable bet here with ace-2. Occasionally he'll show up with something like ace-9 and I'll lose the pot, but most of the time he's going to have either a jack or a 6 and be either collaring or folding. This time he had ace-5. I'd have to suspect that's near the top of his range in this situation. So I'm ISOing the weaker player again with king-queen of off out of the small blind. It's going to be well ahead of his range. We can see that he's relatively loose at 54% pre-flop. And on this board texture, under the similar auspices of the last several hands, I'm going to be making a small bet to try to fold out his minimal equity in this situation. He, of course, calls. And king-queen here is going to be a borderline turn call. It's borderline because the 4th flush card kills it. So it's never going to be a super profitable turn call. And I make the call. And he jams all in. Which is an unfortunate situation for my hand. Of course it's a fold. This is going to be near the bottom of my range. So we've got a button open. I defend ace-5 off in the big blind. We're going to see a c-bet and me fold. I don't know. I guess he probably limps in the small blind and then we check through. And of course I'm calling here with my gut shot. I'm folding the turn with my gut shot to the pot size bet. We'll see me check fold this flop. It checks through. I hit a 3. I'm going to check. I'm going to check call the turn because I've got the 4 of clubs and a pair, which gives me probably 35 to 40% equity against his betting range there. And he apparently bet a slightly worse 3 for value. This actually, if I'd had this hand prior to the previous one where I played against him, where he called the small flop bet and then bet the turn in river against ace-2, I might be more inclined to fold the turn with ace-2. Because we can see that he's just checking back complete air on this board texture, which means he probably usually just check folds air when we combine that with his fold to c-bet numbers. And I missed a hand in the middle. So 6 is out of the small blind. It's either a 3-bet or a call. I've called this hand for a long time out of the small blind, but it seems like most of the stronger computer programs, at least Poker Snowy, favors a 3-bet here. So it might be a little bit better to 3-bet this hand rather than call it. On this board texture, obviously check folding. When the Queen of Clubs comes out, again, I'm check folding. I'm very hopeful that he has like 2s or 3s at this point in time, which apparently he didn't. He had ace-4 and had given up on that particular board texture. You'll see me 3-bet king-queen off here. I'm going to make this small bet again under similar auspices. This board texture is a little more marginal for the smaller bet size. In fact, I think I probably made a slight mistake making it. That being said, if I remember right, this fellow folds quite a bit to c-bets in 3-bet pots. 44% of the time. So he isn't necessarily defending optimally. If he under-defends to this small bet, I make a lot of money with this sort of hand. So the smaller bet's very good against players who just choose never to, or choose not to deviate from their standard strategy versus it. If you have a player who chooses to call 40% of, or 60% of his hands against a 2/3 pot size bet, and he now still calls 60% of hands against a 1/3 pot size bet, the 1/3 pot size bet as a bluff is going to make a lot more money. Thanks guys for watching. This is Tайлер Форестер for RunItOnce.com.